21 days. That is how long the garrison inside Fort Jeanne d'Arc kept fighting after General George Patton had already declared the city of Metz captured. Not 21 days of confusion. 21 days of a Wehrmacht commander refusing, on direct order from Berlin, to open the gates of a fortress that everyone on the American side already considered finished. We're going to tell you everything about how that siege actually ended today, but I have to warn you that some of what follows is hard to sit with. Now, if you're still here, let's start with why a 19th-century fort was still capable of stopping the United States Third Army in the last winter of the war. By November 1944, the Third Army had already crossed France faster than almost any army in modern military history had crossed anything, from the beaches of Normandy to the German border in a matter of weeks. Patton expected Metz to be one more line on the map that gave way the way everything else had given way that summer. Instead, a ring of forts nobody in Washington had spent much time studying turned a projected few days of fighting into nearly 3 months, and turned a Wehrmacht order written in Berlin into the actual, physical reason American soldiers were still dying outside a French city in the middle of winter. Part 1. Metz sits close enough to the German border that it has changed hands twice in living memory before 1944. Seized by Germany after the Franco-Prussian War in 1871, returned to France in 1918. In between, the Germans had ringed the city with a belt of concrete fortifications, some of them dating to the 1870s and reinforced since, designed to make Metz one of the most heavily fortified positions in Europe. When Patton's Third Army reached the city in September 1944, fresh off the breakout from Normandy and the race across France, it expected another quick advance. It got a siege. American forces spent from late September until mid-December fighting through a ring of forts that included Fort Driant, Fort Jeanne d'Arc, Fort Verdun, and a chain of smaller positions the G is nicknamed the Seven Dwarves. This was the first time since the Franco-Prussian War that Metz had been taken by direct assault, and every fort in that ring had been built, generations earlier, by German engineers who understood exactly what it would take to make an attacker pay for every yard. Historians of the battle go further back than 1871 to make the point. The last time Metz had fallen to a direct military assault before Patton's Third Army was in the year 451, when Attila the Hun sacked the city. By that measure, Patton was not just fighting the German First Army in the autumn of 1944. He was fighting roughly 1,500 years of the city's reputation for not falling at all. Part of why the Germans had time to prepare that defense at all traces back to August. The Third Army had been racing across France so fast after the Normandy breakout that it had effectively outrun its own fuel supply. The pause that followed, forced by logistics rather than strategy, gave the German First Army under General Otto von Knobelsdorff time to reoccupy and rearm a fortress ring that had been sitting half forgotten since the First World War. By the time Patton's tanks reached Metz, the delay he had not chosen had already cost him the element of surprise against the single most heavily fortified city on his entire route to Germany. Patton found out exactly what that meant on September 27th, when he sent elements of the 5th Infantry Division against Fort Driant, 5 miles southwest of the city, a position built from steel-reinforced concrete, ringed by a dry moat and wire, and armed with 5 batteries of 150mm guns, along with armored machine gun posts. Within 2 days, 2 companies of the 11th Infantry had taken roughly 50% casualties without reaching any objective that actually mattered to capturing the fort. Daylight attacks were cut down by fire from the neighboring forts, which covered Driant from every angle its designers had anticipated. Night attacks broke down into confusion when German troops came up out of tunnels behind the American lines that nobody on the attacking side had known existed. After more than 2 weeks of this, on the night of October 12th into the 13th, Patton's own deputy commander ordered the survivors withdrawn, with Patton's agreement. The Third Army had lost 64 men killed, 547 wounded, and 187 missing or presumed captured, for a fort that was still standing when the Americans pulled out. It was, by every account, the only battle George Patton ever lost outright, and it happened 5 weeks before the fight for the city of Metz itself had even properly begun. The reason those forts kept fighting long after the city had effectively fallen was not confusion. and it was not an accident of communications. In March 1944, Hitler had personally issued a standing order that certain fortress cities were to be held at all costs, and that their commanders could surrender only with his direct, personal approval he had no intention of ever giving. This was not a suggestion passed down through a chain of command that might soften it in the retelling. It was a standing directive from the head of state to the officers holding the Metz forts, and it meant that opening a fortress gate to the Americans was not simply a tactical decision. It was treason, on paper, punishable by the death of the man who gave the order, and very possibly his family at home. Metz was not an isolated case of this policy. Earlier in 1944, Hitler had already designated a string of Atlantic and Channel ports, Brest, Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, Dunkirk, and others, as fortresses to be held to the last man, regardless of the wider military situation. Garrisons in some of those ports fought on for months after the front had moved past them entirely, still under siege when Germany itself surrendered in May 1945. Metz was simply the same doctrine applied inland, to a city Hitler had decided the Reich could not be seen to lose without a fight, whatever the actual military value of holding it turned out to be. Part 2. November 8, 1944, was the date Patton had chosen to launch the main coordinated push, by 2 full corps at once, against the Metz fortifications. By his own account in his memoir, War as I Knew It, he woke at 3 in the morning that day, in heavy rain, unable to get back to sleep, and picked up a copy of Rommel's book, Infantry Attacks, to pass the time. He happened to turn to a chapter describing a fight in the rain in September 1914. He found it reassuring, he wrote, because if the Germans could fight through weather like that, so could he. That is the general the popular image remembers as fearless, lying awake before dawn reading his enemy's old war stories for courage, on the exact same day the German side of the battle was about to change hands. General der Infanterie Otto von Knobelsdorff commanded the German First Army defending the sector, but the direct defense of the Metz forts themselves fell to a fortress commandant, General Wohlrath Lübbe. As the American attack intensified in early November, Hitler dispatched a specialist to stiffen the defense. General Lieutenant Heinrich Kittel, an officer with direct experience in fortress warfare from the Eastern Front, arrived at Metz on November 8, 1944, the same rainy morning Patton was reading about a battle 30 years gone, specifically to advise Lübbe on how to hold the position for a final showdown with the Third Army. He did not have to wait long to take command outright. On November 14th, Lübbe suffered a stroke. Kittel took over the defense of Metz that same day, and by every account he took Hitler's order literally. The garrison would fight to the last man, and the forts would not open. Kittel was not a political appointee sent to Metz to make a symbolic last stand. He was, by the standards of his own army, a genuine specialist, brought in from the Eastern Front specifically because he understood fortress warfare better than the officer he was replacing. That detail matters because it means the defense of Metz was not run by an amateur clinging to an order out of blind loyalty alone. It was run by a professional who understood exactly how much damage a well-sighted concrete gun position could do to an attacking infantry division, and who had already watched the Americans discover that same lesson personally at Fort Driant 5 weeks earlier, at a cost of nearly 800 casualties for a fort the Americans never actually took. If this story is landing the way it should, hit the like button right now. It helps us keep making videos like this one. Part 3. On the evening of November 20th, 1944, while the fight for the city itself was still raging, an American sergeant named Leonard O'Reilly, a former elevator operator from Brooklyn, was clearing a brewery near Metz that Waffen-SS troops had just abandoned after a hard defense. Moving through the dark, O'Reilly spotted a figure cringing in a dusty corner. He approached and found a well-dressed German officer who immediately informed him that his rank was too high to surrender to a mere sergeant. O'Reilly's answer was to shove his pistol into the man's stomach and cock it. The officer reconsidered immediately and joined the other prisoners. The man O'Reilly had just found hiding in a brewery basement was Major General Anton Dunkern, the SS commander for the region, a Nazi party member since the earliest years of the movement. He was significant enough a capture that Patton chose to interrogate him personally through an interpreter, because, as Patton put it at the time, he would not demean himself by speaking directly to the man, even though Patton spoke fluent German. The exchange was recorded and survives in Patton's own papers. Patton opened by telling the interpreter that he had captured a great many German generals, but that this was the first one who had been untrue to everything, a Nazi who had then been untrue to the Nazis by surrendering at all. Duncan tried to explain that he had been unable to reach his weapons before he was taken. Patton called him a liar to his face, through the interpreter, and told him that if he had wanted to die a good Nazi, he had his chance and missed it, and that his death now would have been more pleasant than what was coming. Duncan tried, more than once, to insist he should be classified as a prisoner of war of the American forces, rather than handed to the French, who he clearly understood would treat him less gently. That fear was not paranoia. As the SS commander responsible for the region, Duncan would have been directly connected to the policing and repression of occupied Lorraine, and by late 1944, French authorities were already moving fast and hard against collaborators and occupying officials, with summary justice common enough that Patton's threat carried real weight rather than being an empty debating point. Patton told him that was not his decision to make, called him a policeman of the lowest type for his SS service, and ended the session by having the guards photograph him and reminding him, through the interpreter, that the guards' bayonets were very sharp. Duncan survived the war. He returned to Munich, trained as a lawyer, and died there in 1985 at 80 years old, having answered for essentially none of it. Part 4. Kittel did not get to grow old. On November 21st, the day after Duncan's capture, Kittel was wounded in the fighting and taken prisoner. The city of Metz itself, the built-up urban area, was declared cleared, and hostilities there formally ceased on November 22, 1944. 3 days later, on November 25th, Patton made his own triumphal entry into the city, the first commander in roughly 1,500 years to take Metz by force. By any ordinary measure, the battle was over. Patton had his objective, the parade had happened, and the map showed Metz in American hands. The forts did not agree with the map. American commanders, unwilling to spend more infantry storming concrete positions built specifically to punish infantry assaults, made a deliberate choice. Direct attacks on the remaining holdout forts were called off in order to preserve artillery ammunition for the next push toward the Saar. The forts were surrounded, cut off from resupply and from the city they had been built to defend, and left to decide for themselves how long a fortress order from a head of state in Berlin was worth honoring after the war around it had already moved 100 miles east. Part 5. They decided it was worth quite a lot. Fort Verdun surrendered on November 26th, 4 days after the city fell, the first significant crack in the ring. Around it, the smaller positions the Americans had nicknamed the Seven Dwarves, a chain of fortifications screening the approach to Fort Jeanne d'Arc, were bypassed rather than stormed. Exactly the caution learned 5 weeks earlier at Driant, applied at scale across the whole ring. The remaining forts did not fall all at once. They came in one at a time, each commandant apparently making his own private calculation about the order he was under, the men he had left, and how much longer holding a gate shut actually served any purpose beyond the order itself. The last to give in was Fort Jeanne d'Arc, roughly 5 miles west of the city, garrisoned by 1,900 men and armed with 6 100mm guns, 6 150mm howitzers, 4 77mm guns, and a network of machine gun positions built into concrete that American artillery had already spent weeks failing to crack. It surrendered on December 13, 1944, 21 days after Metz itself had been declared taken, the final fortress in the ring to open its gates. Think about what that means for the men inside it. For 3 weeks, the war for Metz was already over everywhere except inside that one fort. The city had a new administration. The front line had moved on without them. 1,900 men sat inside a fortress with no realistic prospect of relief, no supply line, and no strategic reason left to keep fighting, obeying an order from a man who was not there, who would never see the fort, and who had made surrender formally equivalent to treason, regardless of the circumstances on the ground. By the time Fort Jeanne d'Arc finally surrendered, the Third Army itself had already moved on without it, pushing east toward the Saar River and the Siegfried Line, the next fortified line standing between Patton and Germany itself. In the accounting of the entire campaign, the fort's holdout changed almost nothing about where the front actually was. It only changed how long 1,900 men had to sit inside a concrete shell, cut off, waiting on an order from Berlin that both sides, by December, understood to be coming from a government that was running out of time to give any order at all. German records compiled after the war put their own losses in the defense of Metz at roughly 400 dead and 2,200 wounded, about half of whom had already been evacuated before the ring closed. Kittel himself survived his wounds and spent the rest of the war as an American prisoner, captured a full 3 weeks before the last of the forts he had been sent to save finally surrendered. He never commanded the men who held out those final 3 weeks. Whoever did, holding the door shut at Fort Jeanne d'Arc after his own fortress commandant was already gone, was following an order phoned in from a capital that had already lost the war and simply had not said so out loud yet. The verdict. Why did a Wehrmacht garrison keep a fortress sealed for 3 weeks after the battle around it was already lost? Because Hitler had converted an ordinary military decision, when to stop fighting a hopeless position, into a capital political one, and he had done it months before the siege ever started, specifically so that commanders in Kittel's position would have no legal room to make the call themselves. Kittel took Hitler's order literally enough to be wounded and captured rather than surrender the city. Whoever commanded Fort Jeanne d'Arc in its final days took it literally enough to hold out 3 weeks past the point of any military purpose, against guns that had already proven they could not be cracked quickly, for an order signed by a man who by December 1944 could not have relieved that fort if he had wanted to. They remember concrete corridors built by their own grandfather's generation of engineers, meant to make an attacker bleed for every yard. They remember an order from Berlin that made the door itself the only thing standing between an officer and a charge of treason. They remember holding a line long after the reason for the line had already moved 100 miles away. And on the other side of that same siege, an American sergeant from Brooklyn remembered finding a general cowering in a brewery basement, too proud to surrender to a man of the wrong rank, until a pistol in the stomach settled the question of rank for him. Both of those memories belong to the same 3 weeks, in the same French city, in the same war, and neither one required Berlin's permission to be true. Now you know what was in the file. Did your father or grandfather serve with the 3rd Army in Lorraine in the fall of 1944? Tell us his name and unit in the comments below, and if you want more stories like this, the ones that were never supposed to reach you, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss what's coming next. Thank you for watching.